This time around, you notice that I have a prop, and indeed quite an old one, going back to the 1950s. It's been in my family for a very long time, and you may be able to see the label here. This is a Boombass, originally produced in Chicago by the Boombass company, which actually filed for a patent on it. Eventually, a lot of the manufacturing of this shifted to Philadelphia, but this is one of the original ones that was in fact produced in Chicago, and the plaque here reads, "The Boombass, built by the Boombass Company, 1800 Belle Plaine Avenue, Chicago, 13, Illinois." So what is this? This is sometimes called a one-man band. There's some other names for this out there, and you can, if you search well enough online, you can find people selling these on various instrument sites. And why is it called a one-man band? It's essentially one giant percussion thing that you can use in various ways. So you notice that it's got these cymbals up here that you can clack. You might have a drumstick or something like that. You can knock them with your hands as well. And, of course, since it's got this bumper on the bottom, you can bang the cymbals like that if you want to. It's also got two other useful percussion instruments, a wood block. You can make all sorts of sounds with that. Cowbell. Can't have enough cowbell, as you know. And then it's got this tambourine, and we were always fascinated with this as kids. And the tambourine, you can bang it like that. You can jingle it. You can play the twanger, let's call it. I'm sure there's a technical name for this sort of thing. And so you might be, banging it and doing whatever you want with it. And we made a lot of racket with this as kids, me and my sister. Now, where did this come from? How did this wind up in my family? So this has to do with my grandpa Sadler, my dad's father, who we all called Grandpa Joe. His name was Josef. He was actually Slovenian and changed his name from Skufka to Sadler when he went into business in the late 20s or early 30s, in part because there was so much prejudice against Slavs at the time, particularly Southern Slavs. So anyway, he became kind of a big businessman and wound up in Chicago, wound up living in Arlington Heights. That's where they built a house. My dad was born and grew up there. And Grandpa Sadler lived in Chicago at that house, which we would go to visit pretty frequently with my grandmother until she died in 1977. And she was in her 50s. She had cancer, unfortunately. And so she passed away kind of early. And unfortunately, Grandpa Sadler was a very hardcore alcoholic. So his wife dying, who handled most of the household affairs, and being an alcoholic, did not mix well. My dad went down there, about a week after the funeral, found the place just a mess, bottles everywhere. Grandpa basically sleeping in his clothes and said, "Hey, Dad, you're coming up to live with us." And so Grandpa Sadler brought a bunch of stuff, typewriter. He used to have a consulting company, all this letterhead, all of his things. And among them was the Boombass. And I guess he figured that we kids could use it. So he didn't actually tell us anything about it other than it was a one-man band, People used these in vaudeville. But he gave it to me and my sister to do whatever the hell we wanted with, because he didn't want it. I don't know why he had it. We never got that story from him. He might have actually just picked it up in a store or something like that. And so it's interesting. I actually did a little bit of research. Unfortunately, when you try to search for this, there are people out there who use the name boom bass for a kind of music or for a musical artist. So you got to be pretty selective in your searching. But what I did find out is there was indeed a boom bass company, and they were actually doing quite well. This instrument is from the 1950s. They continued producing them into the 1960s, and then the market for them basically dried up. Now, why was that? Well, because what became big in the 60s? Rock and roll. I mean, rock and roll was around in the 50s, but it really took off in terms of people wanting to play their own instruments, form their own bands, take off on this wave. And instruments like this just kind of, were old-fashioned, and they're always seen as kind of like low class in a way. So, you didn't actually want this. And this is a time, too, when folk music was also becoming big. That's when my dad bought his banjo that became my banjo that you've seen in other videos. But in any case, we kids loved this thing, and we'd get it out, and we'd just make a lot of racket with it. And the neighbor kids thought it was super cool as well. So, you got all these different sounds that you can make with it. And it's just sort of tailor-made for kids who might not have a ton of musical talent, but love to make noise. I'm sure my parents didn't really appreciate Grandpa giving this boom bass to us, but we enjoyed it, and it stayed in our place. After my dad died and Grandpa went with his older son, who was my dad's half-brother, to where he eventually would die in 1990. We kept this, and every once in a while we'd get it out and, make a little noise with it. We'd play with it and things like that. And then I think what ended up happening, I will say this. So I played banjo and I played bass, and we would get this out every once in a while with my friends who wanted to make music, some of whom didn't have much talent, some of whom were a bit better at that. And, they would check it out, and some of them would play it themselves, and it was just part of the scene that we had. And then, I went off to college, and I think what happened is this stayed in my mom's basement out in Waukesha, and then she moved to Menominee Falls and into a new house there, and I think this came with her. And it's one of those things that my sister and I discovered when my mother died in 2000, and we had to go through all of her stuff, including my old bass guitar and my dad's banjo and stuff like that. And I decided that I wanted to have this and maybe pass it down to my own kids. Unfortunately, neither of my kids showed much interest in this thing, and maybe that'll change as they get older. Maybe I just need to introduce them to it again, because it is a really cool thing, but it's kind of a museum piece as well. So I don't know, maybe we won't give it to the kids. We dug it out at one point when at my family reunion, which we haven't gone to for quite a while, but it's a kind of a big production, the Lemrys family reunion. We have a talent show, and a lot of families are musical and will sing. There's a barbershop quartet, there's other things, and I would often play my bass or my banjo. And, once my kids started getting interested in that, Kat would play the bass and I would play the banjo, and Maddie would sing, like we did AC/DC's TNT and a couple other songs as well. And I think I brought this along one time to the reunion. And I think one of my kids played it, and I think one of my older cousins also got up there and played it. Or maybe it was my Uncle Aimee, And they, of course, you don't have to be very good with this, but most people aren't very good with it either. So it was kind of, thrown together and half-assed, you could say. But it's a lot of fun. I think there's the look of this thing just by itself kind of says fun times, crazy times, old-timey stuff. So I don't know what's going to end up happening with this. It's a family heirloom. I will probably keep it wherever I go. I probably should, shine up the cowbell and clean up the tambourine and the woodblock and the cymbals. But I don't know. We'll see what happens down the line with this. So this is a little bit of a shorter story, but, this is an interesting artifact that has its own history, its own story to tell. You can see that we've actually put it through a lot of abuse. We kids were not particularly good about things. The cymbals probably need to be bent to be, completely circular, because I think we've dented it a little bit, maybe in moving, but it's in pretty decent shape for something from the 1950s. I mean, presumably this thing could, at this point, be 70 years old. Certainly, it's no less than 60 years old. So that's the story of the boom bass from the Sadler family, passed down to us kids from my Grandpa Joe Sadler, and currently I'm the keeper of it at present.